Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and today we're headed out west. And normally when we say that, we stop in Colorado, we've stopped in Nevada, we've gone up to Washington even. But not many times do we head down to California. And today we are joined by David Souza of Corbin Cash Distillery. He is founder of the whiskey brand, second in command from a farming perspective, so grain to glass. And you know, Scott and I have an affinity for those types of distilleries, and we are so excited to have you on the Bourbon Lens today. So David, how's it going?
Great. Thank you guys for having me. It's always exciting to talk to people out east, to get to know a little bit about our whiskey out west. So always fun.
For sure. So it's, fall here in Kentucky has arrived. It went from like 80 degrees on Sunday down to like 30. So what's the weather happening in your neck of the woods right now?
So we're into fall. 2 weeks ago was 116 and now we're 80. So a little bit drastic as well, just not quite as cold as you guys yet. So, but yeah, it's definitely fall is here, and I'm so glad because it's my favorite time of year.
Yeah, like it's fun. Like fall is a great time, especially I'm sure for a farmer, right? It's a busy time of the year from a harvest perspective and things like that. But for you, like farmer is sun up to sundown, whiskey making is sun up to sundown almost these days. Like, how do you, like as an individual, this is just a personal question, like how do you stay grounded in this whiskey and farming industry to keep yourself sane?
Yeah, I've been working in the farm since I was 7. So it's like I get up at 3:30 every day and start the still. I'm the first one in, but I like it that way just because it gives me time to think and plan. Because otherwise, once everybody's in, like that's when the insanity starts. So my sane happens from 3:30 to about 6:30. I get my thinking time and I get my time to like really do myself and kind of plan for the week. But it's hard. It's a lot, especially this time of year because we got harvest going all around, 3 different crops rolling, and on top of whiskey making and then managing a sales side of it, helping the sales team manage, I guess, what our goal sets are. So it's definitely a lot.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have it any other way, I don't think.
That's
awesome. 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't wake up that way intentionally ever. So props to you for that.
It's just kind of the way being this lead distiller. On the farm, we typically start about 5, but since the distillery's been picking up the way our shifts work, it's nobody really wants to start that early. So I'm okay with it. Problem is getting to bed early enough because, you got to finish work, go home, be a dad, and then all that stuff, and then try to get to bed by like 9 if I'm lucky. So, it's long days.
Yeah. No, I can only imagine. And then like, it just shows, right? Like people in the whiskey business are family people too, right? Like it's in the farm, like there's other stuff other than just the job. Like people like, we talked about this in our like a little mini series we did, like those off hours moments, but just hearing you talk, like finding those moments in between, how to be a real human, how to be a dad, how to be a boss, like all those things, like that comes with the territory. And that's hard when you're up at the butt crack of dawn and, going to bed before, like right when Jeopardy's over.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, and I think it's just, because we've been in business so long as a family business, and so our average employee, we were talking about this the other day, our average employee has been with us for 35 years. That's our average employee on the farm. So the guy under my dad that runs the field crews, he's been with our family for 50 years. He's been working for us. And he's like, we're like, are you going to ever retire? He's like, I was going to, but then I was like, I don't know if I want to be home with my wife all the time. She's like, I think I got another year in me. He's funny.
Oh man.
But yeah, we were doing that math the other day because we were doing some interviews on the farm side for some county people, and they're just like, yeah, we're looking up records, and it's like, and we're just like going over employees and stuff, and like, yeah, man, like some of these guys, they've been here longer than I've been alive. It's crazy when you think about it.
That's crazy. And I think what's also interesting, like we talk about agriculture in California, a lot of people don't realize like a lot of our sustainable agriculture, not just from a US perspective, but from a worldwide perspective, is happening in California. I think a lot of people just think it's, like avocados, but there's so much agriculture happens like outside of, the major cities, like between LA and San Francisco. There's a lot of that's farmland, right? Like, and you're producing the world's food.
Yeah. Yeah, no, from almonds, sweet potatoes, you got dairies, you've got rice, you've got grains, it's just peaches, apricots, like there's lemons, a lot of citrus and olives and raisins. And it's just almost anything that doesn't need a real, even wine grapes, not really great wine grapes. That's when you go to Napa and Paso, but we do have wine grapes here. Yeah. Obviously, Gallo, the biggest winery in the world, is located 15 minutes from me. So, yeah, and then you've got all the regulations happening here, and so it's kind of a crazy place to be a farmer because, yes, we're probably one of the most progressive states, but we're most highly regulated state when it comes to anything. So water challenges, we're farming what used to be a desert. And, when my great grandfather started, the farming here there was quite a bit of agriculture, but not near of what we have today, given the reservoirs that were built over the years to allow water to be diverted for farming. And so being able to hold those waters in the reservoir from rain has been amazing, except now we don't get much rain. Yeah. So those weather patterns are changing. So
yeah. No, for sure. And like, for you all, right, with a lineage and a heritage in farming, we've talked about this with the Freys and the Hubers and some other, folks, like there's a lineage in farming, and then there's like this transition into distillation in that process. Like how was that for you all to come in, and we'll get to the whole family history here in a minute, but like, how was it to make that transition from, farmer to distiller?
It was interesting. Like, people are like, oh, what made you do it? And for me, it was more about, I wasn't a brewer. Like I never made beer or anything. For me, it was kind of what we were talking before with the interview is, my dad is kind of still number one. My grandfather has passed on. And my dad and I are not very far apart in age. My parents had me really young. So we're like 17 years apart. So I knew I wasn't going to be in charge anytime soon. And so that I was looking to put my own stamp and trying to be, my dad's a huge in sustainability and efficiency. And so I was looking for something that would do that. And kind of my background in other businesses that I had kind of led me to like, hey, what about making alcohol? And it was really, the interest came when somebody taught me really in my late 20s, early 30s, really how to drink good whiskey and good vodka and good gin. And I'm like, oh, there really is such thing as good alcohol. And that's kind of when that light kicked in and like, okay, let me see if I can put my own stamp on this. And so it was an interesting transition. Bought a book off the internet, built a still, and 3 years later had a full-blown distillery. So it was a lot of trial and error. I have no formal education in distilling, so it was literally just trial and error to get it done. So it wasn't easy, that's for sure.
I mean, I can't imagine building my own still. Like, I can put things together if I have instructions, but like trying to piecemeal a still together doesn't sound really like something I could wrap my brain around.
Yeah, and it wasn't very fancy. Don't let it think of it as fancy. So it was like a beer keg and some copper pipe. I mean, it was like a moonshine still, but it was very primitive looking. And I still have it today. Got pictures of it when I started with it, but little 5-gallon thing. And it was really just to see, like, could sweet potato alcohol be made? And then could the rye that we grow, the Merced rye, is a specific varietal that we grow here, and it's very drought tolerant. And a lot of people told me, oh, you can't make whiskey from that because it's such a low starch content compared to Midwestern rye or Canadian rye. And the fastest way to get me to do something is tell me that I can't do it. So I really put my nose to the grindstone and, proved it's possible. It isn't the biggest producer as a Canadian rye or Midwestern rye, so our volumes aren't as large, but it definitely turned out to be sustainable and work with our farming operation. So pretty proud of that.
I think that's super interesting. And for those people who don't know, like, go out to corbincash.com. There's a really nice video that you're welcomed with. And the new still is very highlighted there right in front. Looks like a column hybrid pot still.
Yeah, hybrid.
So love the hybrid. I think it's the best of both worlds from a whiskey making perspective. And also, like, since you're producing gin and vodka as well, right? It's a good way to strip and then finish off, distillation process. So everyone knows I nerd out on stills all the time, but like, it's interesting, like how a lot of these grain to glass distilleries have gone to that type of hybrid methodology to meet the production of all the different types of whiskey and spirits they're making.
Yeah. In the hybrid stills too, there's so much, like, we have so many levers and control on it, and we're doing it such a slow process. It allows us to make some really good stuff. Where some of these just column stills or just pot stills, you have to do it you might have to distill it 2 or 3 times to get the product to where you want it. With the hybrid, you never really have to do more than 2. But sometimes you can just dial it in and you get it right one time. So each product is a little different, like you said, from vodka to gins and whiskeys, but there's so much adjustment with it, which makes a craft distiller's life easier, I should say.
Nothing is easy, right?
Yeah.
Nothing's easy. No, we're always looking for easier.
So, it's really interesting, right? Like we've covered a lot, but I want to backtrack a little bit because I think we'd be remiss if we didn't highlight an abridged version of how you all got to Atwater, since you've been there for over 100 years. And the name Corbin Cash, just in general, like, how did what's the anthology of that? And then, like, how did you all even get to Atwater?
Yeah. So my grandfather came from the Azore Islands, in Portugal, and came by boat when he was 16, landed in Boston, took a train out to Santa Cruz and worked in the silver mines there for about 6-8 months, saved up some money, and then ended up, there's a big Portuguese community here in Atwater. So I'm assuming that's why he ended up here. We didn't have any family here. But there was a big dairy, which he knew about farming dairy, and they did grow sweet potatoes on the islands back there. So he was very familiar with those farming practices. The soil was a lot different here, but what we did, talking to my grandfather, he said the soil was a lot more fertile here and a lot easier to work with, being super sandy versus the kind of the whole harder rocky ground of an island. So Yeah, he thrived here. He was one of the first ones with a tractor in our area. After doing the horse and plow thing for so many years, when tractors were available, he was the first one to jump on that. So being the kind of inventive through the farming has been a really, really big piece of our history. And then the name Corbin Cash came from my son. So he is the fifth generation. His name was, so normally a lot of people use their family name, Souza. Well, ours is already taken by a tequila. So, and I share the same attorney as Jim Beam, and Jim Beam owns the rights to Souza Tequila. Even though they're spelled, one's with an A, one's with an O, they said it's very close and you should not use your name because they will sue you. So I had to look for something else. And so then I was thinking, well, my son's going to be born. I was going to have a child. And if it's a boy, I could come up with a cool name and name it after him. So Corbin Cash, named after two country singers, Johnny Cash and Easton Corbin, is how we came up with his name. And I thought it sounded pretty cool whiskey name. So that's where we landed it.
Easy enough for me. I think sometimes like you can overcomplicate things, and sticking to something easy and coming up with a cool name sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. No, it was kind of first just going to be Cash. And then I heard the song one day and I'm like, dude, this is a pretty cool song. And then I looked down and I'm like, Easton Corbin. And that's kind of like, oh, Corbin Cash. I think that's got a ring to it. And so, yeah, I feel like it's got a nice little ring. I wish it was my name.
Yep.
So
no,
keeping him, I just got to keep him grounded.
He may not be interested in farming. He may just be off to be a country music star.
That's where he's at right now, taking singing lessons and playing guitar. So I kind of hope he gets to do all three, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well-rounded individual.
Yeah. And he loves farming. It's funny because he asked me the other day, actually, it wasn't the other day. It was about 2 years ago when he first brought this up. He's sitting contemplating and on the couch. I'm like, dude, what are you thinking about? He's like, he's a very serious kid. He's like, I don't know how I'm going to be a farmer and a distiller, Dad. And he goes, there's you and Papa, and what happens with me? And I have to do all of it. And I'm like, well, we're not going anywhere just yet. And you got a lot of people that'll be backing you. So you'll be okay. But that's how he thinks it. This was when he was 10, so he's 12 now. But he loves the farm. He loves driving tractors and getting out there and helping. So, and he loves to talk about the distillery.
Oh, sweet.
So,
no, that's awesome. Has he run the still yet?
He's run bottling line. He runs the mill, both mills, sweet potato mill and the grain mill. He sticks his finger in there and smells the liquor, but I don't let him run the still. But he definitely runs the forklift, and he does a lot of work in the distillery though. He's been driving. I've had him on a tractor since he was 2, so he's very familiar with driving.
I don't know if I could operate any heavy machinery, and I'm 30, almost 33.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the blessings you don't realize until you leave and like go outside in the world. And even friends of his that live in the country, they've never been, able to be a part of having tractors and stuff. And it wasn't until I started going out and doing sales and in, the Bay Area and LA and even Vegas and understanding like how lucky we are to grow up in this environment. You learn so much on a farm. It's kind of crazy, like how to plumb, how to weld, pretty much how to work with wood. Like we kind of do everything. You know, I wouldn't say we're masters at it all, but we definitely learn how to do it. So we'll work with it. So
yeah,
it's been a hell of an upbringing. I can't say it probably took it for granted as a kid, but love it now.
No, I think that's pretty awesome. And so, you know, you've gone on this journey. When did you all start the still? Like when did you first start tinkering, and when did you kind of go to like lay down your first barrels?
So 2007 was 2005, 2006, kind of when my brain started like thinking this whole thing and like what I could do next. 2007 is when I actually, you know, bought a book off the internet and kind of put a still together and started doing this in my garage. 2009, we had a fully licensed distillery, and 2010 was when we started laying down our first barrels and making vodka and the rye. So, and then our first release of rye was actually 2014. So we waited 4 years before we actually launched anything into the market.
So you weren't one of those people, or one of the distilleries. A lot of times when they start with rye, right, they're like 2 years, like got to get it out, 24 months. Like when you all kind of like thought about that, like was it a very conscious thought, like, hey, 4 years is what we want to do, or did you just kind of taste along the way and it was ready when it was ready?
Ready when it was ready. Like it was funny. I wasn't in a big hurry at that time. Because we had been in the vodka business for so long at 2 and 3 years, and we had such a struggle selling craft vodka. I'm like, well, you know, and then rye whiskey, going back to 2010 to 14, rye whiskey really wasn't that popular. Like there was some rye whiskeys out there, but it really wasn't like a thing yet. And so I was just like kind of reading the market. I'm like, you know, nobody's really, when I talk about 100% rye, people's like, oh, that's cool. What's it going to taste like? But for me, it was sheerly that it didn't taste good. At 2 years for us, I'm like, I've never had a barrel of 2-year-old rye that tasted right out of our distillery. So 3 years, I was like, okay, we're on to something. But 4 years was kind of that mark. And honestly, now we don't really have anything less than 5 years. If I find a 4-year-old barrel that's good, we might throw it in there, but we don't mark anything less than 5 years old now. Because to me, 1917, that's the year we started farming. But that was kind of that's the number of days that I feel like that's our sweet spot with the rye. It's about 5.25 years. Our standard bottle of rye is it is at 5 years. That's the youngest stuff we have. But for cash strength, it's kind of that 1917 days is like that 123 proof is kind of that sweet spot. So that's kind of what I picked, and we've kind of stuck with that. So 4 years was good, but 5 years is just better.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Merced. Oh, Scott, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I thought it was pretty interesting. The 1917, you know, that's when you started farming, but somewhere along the way, you figured out that was about how many days as well that you were wanting to age. So
it was kind of a fluke. It just kind of one day when we were trying to put the cash strength out, I was like, well, you know, we want it to be its own thing. And then, you know, I love math, and I was sitting here, well, you know, from a marketing perspective, and I was like, oh, wow, that's like, this is right in the sweet spot of when, you know, the 1900, how many days is this? And it just kind of happened to be where it's at. So, but yeah, interesting little tidbit there.
Yeah, no. So I think, you know, now that we've broached the conversation of the whiskey itself, let's talk a little bit about this. So you all were gracious enough to send 2 whiskeys our way, the Merced Rye, barrel proof, because, you know, you're like, oh, y'all are Kentuckians, you need to drink the hot stuff.
Yeah.
And then we have the bourbon, which we'll talk about in a minute. But, you know, from your mash bill perspective, you're doing 100% rye, right? Like there's nothing in there. What made you think about going with that 100% mash bill versus like a 95.5 or a 90.10 to use, so you didn't have to use enzymes or anything like that?
So the truth is, in the very beginning, I just wanted to do 100% everything off our farm. So I didn't want to be reliant on anything other than packaging. So any materials that we were going to make, or any products I was going to produce, I wanted to just try to use 100% from our farm. So, back then I really didn't even understand that there was an MGP making 95% rye. I wasn't that schooled in whiskey at that point. It wasn't until we actually got deeper into it when people would ask me, "Where do you buy your rye?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? Where do I buy it? I make it." And nobody really believed us at first. So until people would come out and, "Oh, you actually have a distillery?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So it was, it was just pure because we wanted to use everything. I didn't realize till later how important that was, other than from a sustainability standpoint of how important that would be to our story down the road. Because as we got deeper into the alcohol world, I didn't realize how many people actually bought whiskey and just put their name on it. So that was something we figured out. And thankfully, because that's some of the challenges I've seen from other craft distilleries that have gotten bought up early, I should say. And then they kind of started off with something they didn't make. And then when the stuff they made doesn't taste the same as what they're selling. So, so that's always, thankfully, I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, no, 100%. So, we're going to do it a little bit backwards. Normally we do bourbon rye, but we're going to do rye bourbon because, that was, the baby of the whole conversation. So this is barrel proof, 123, around 5 years and a quarter old. The color, like mahogany, like I feel like that's, you got to go deep into your wood Rolodex to pick out a color on this one. Compared to the bourbon, it's like extra dark. And so that's one of the first questions I had just about the whiskey. Like, why do you think it is so dark?
The heat. So we have this uncontrollable heat here that it goes deep into the wood. And so that's something that I learned after about 6 years into the whiskey aging process, that once we get past this 5-year mark and we get into the 6 and the 7s, and we even have an 8-year now, you have to really pay attention to what's in the barrel and what's going on in our temperatures in our rick houses, because our rick houses on those 116 days like we just had, we can hit 140 in there. And so it really just draws deep into the wood. And the first experience I had with a 6-year-old barrel, I wasn't really pleased with it. So, because I was like, man, we have this 1917. I cannot wait till we hit 6. And so my first 6-year barrel, we pulled the whiskey out, tasted it, and I'm like, it's good, but it had a little bit of a bite to it that I wasn't too thrilled about. And so I took the barrel apart, and what I found out was that on some of these barrels that were higher up in the rick house, they would, the char or the whiskey was actually surpassing the char. And it was going back into the raw wood and bringing a little bit of that raw wood tannin back into the whiskey. So we were seeing like, oh, this heat is good. It gets us deep in there and it gets it there early. Like you should see the whiskey at 2 years. It's dark because we're so hot. But we have to be very mindful of that. And so we have now we do a special char with our cooperage. They special char them a little bit deeper for us, but I also start temperature controlling and rotating barrels a little bit earlier, just so we don't have that happen. because the last thing you want is to have a couple hundred barrels that are, they're just so close to being good, but they're a little bit fighty. So definitely that was one of our learning curves early on. And thankfully, I'm pretty thankful that I did do so much. I was so anal about testing it because, man, we would have been screwed had we not.
Do you have a pretty high angel share then?
We do. So yeah, we just did some single barrels for one of our local bars. Just bought a single barrel, and when we pulled some down, we actually had one barrel that only had 19 gallons in it. Yeah, 7 years old, 19 gallons, super dark, really rich in flavor, hot. It was like, well, even our 8-year, we hit 136 proof on our 8-year. But there's a few, every once in a while we get some of those. I would say our average loss on a 53 gallon barrel with the 6 and 7s, we're rolling about 25 to 27 gallons out of them. So it's a pretty high angel share.
Now, when you say you're temperature controlling, are you just moving them down, or are you moving them to separate locations?
So we move a little bit of both. So so initially my first rick house it was just an old shop that we had purchased a piece of land. It had this old shop on it that was kind of had crooked floors in it, and it really wasn't good for anything. So I was like, I'm going to store whiskey in this thing. And it's great for the first few years. But then I realized this temperature thing could be an issue after 5 years. So we started insulating the buildings. And what I typically do is I age them. I start with a process just like we do our sweet potatoes. The sweet potatoes, we only hold on to them for about a year. But we start off with just an insulated room now. The original rick house is now insulated. But once we get to a certain temperature, I will induce water coolers. So we do have water coolers in there. So we'll add a little bit of humidity. So the dry, the good thing with dry heat like we have, is we typically evaporate water before alcohol. So our proofs go up, where I know in Kentucky with humidity, you tend to evaporate a little bit more alcohol than us, I think. So we add humidity in there to keep everything a little bit of climate control, but I don't want to add too much humidity because I don't want to evaporate my alcohol over my water. So there's a lot of balancing act in that we're always tweaking.
Yeah.
So
no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And like what makes Merced rye like different versus like, traditional like Midwestern rye or Canadian rye whiskey? Because it's got a really unique like nasal profile. Yeah.
So it's a little bit more aromatic. And it's got a little bit kind of sweet notes to it too, even at high proof. If you looked at them side by side, like grain for grain, the Merced rye is a lot smaller. So the starch content is a lot lower. So a Midwestern or Canadian rye is going to be like 65% on average starch content. Merced rye, we're going to be down like 57 is our high side. And typically we're in the 52 to 55 range. So it's quite a bit less starch, smaller grain. It's no different, I feel, whiskey when you talk about terroir and with wine grapes, and it's no different out here. Midwest, you get a lot of rain. You've got a little bit heavier soil types. Out here, we're super dry. We don't irrigate Merced rye. It's all natural rainfall. So I should say we've had to irrigate it twice in 100 years because we literally had no rain. it was going to die. So we actually did put solid set sprinklers out. But for the most part, we don't rely on rainfall. We rely on rainfall for it, but it's so sporadic. So the rice stresses really, really hard throughout the growing season, and forces it to go deep in its roots to find water. And I don't know if that kind of lessens the spice notes in it and gives it a little bit more of that sweeter, more aromatic, because of the sandy soil that we're on. But I know that our root systems do go down about 13 feet, because of our water table. So, which is good for us back in the old days when we used to flood irrigate everything. See, everything that now is on drip, but when we flood irrigated, a lot of our soil nutrients would go down past the sweet potato roots. So, being this is a cover crop, the Merced rye having a root system go down 13 feet, it would re-grab the nitrogen and the potash that was surpassing down into the sweet potato, past the sweet potato roots. It would go down 13 feet, mine that up, and then we would disc that back in for green fertilizer. So that's part of the sustainability. And I think that's part of the reason it has its unique flavor, because I don't think most ryes are more grassy like. They don't go as deep.
Yeah.
It is my understanding. So
what I find interesting about this is like it's the mix of like juicier fruits, apricot, peach, not citrus, not pine tree or lemon, which is really interesting. But then there's like these chocolatey notes, like milk chocolate, which it's kind of weird. Like I was like, almost chocolate custard would be kind of where I want to like land on a note. But then I'm just like, so I'm over here smelling my glass. I'm like, it's a weird balance. I don't know, Scott, like what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, if you told me that this was a bourbon, I would believe you.
Really,
like
yeah.
it doesn't have, I'm not a rye whiskey drinker, but it doesn't have that grassiness that I usually find in ryes. But I mean, it's super unique. I've got deep, dark, rich nuttiness. It's very oily. It's a little bit warm. I mean, it's
123 proof. Yeah.
It's a little warm. So it does have a little bit of a drying effect as well, but it's super viscous, super oily, which I mean, that's just a nice feature in and of itself. But yeah, if you said, hey, this is a bourbon, check it out. It's 123 proof. I would be like, oh, okay, this is a pretty damn good bourbon. But you tell me it's a rye and I'm like, oh, what?
It reminds me a little bit of barrel seagrass, like from a nose perspective, but the chocolatiness and like the nutty notes on the nose are just so unique. And I think that's what I find. That's why I'm like, people can't see me, but I'm just like sniffing my glass. Like
we pair the rye with chocolate in one of our tastings at the distillery, because it gets this long kind of rich, dark chocolatey, like a combination of dark milky chocolate, but the nuttiness, and everybody's like, where does that come from? And the only thing I could possibly explain on the nuttiness is, so our sweet potato vodka our sweet potato alcohol in general has a nuttiness to it. And that comes from the sweet potato itself has these nutty notes. And because we disc so many sweet potatoes into the ground at the end of the year, and then we plant this rye on top of them. So only thing I could think of is maybe it's drawn some of that nuttiness right from those sweet potatoes themselves. And that because that's part of the soil. So, but I don't know. Yeah, we get that question a lot. It's like, oh, where does it get these specific notes? And we just pulled 3 barrels the other day for the bar that's buying a single barrel, and a lot of like rich, like almost sour apple. Like you were talking about fruits and apricot and that, but it's funny, we get a lot of apple, like almost like Granny Smith apple in there.
Like orchard. So. Yeah. No, so I find that to be really interesting. And I think on the palate, it has those cereal grains, like cereal sweetness, almost like a wheated, like a really high wheat whiskey versus a rye whiskey. So like the chewiness, as Scott mentioned, the mouthfeel, the oiliness, like it gives you like some viscosity there, which is really nice. And then the flavor profile kind of balances out. So extremely unique. And if you're into rye whiskey, like this is something, like Scott said, it could confuse a lot of people real quick.
Yeah.
So you've released this rye, right? And you start this process, and you got your sweet potato vodka thing going, you got your gin going. Like, what's like, hey, let's do bourbon. Like, are you growing corn on your land?
We've grown corn in the past. We currently aren't, but my cousins grow corn down the road. And so it was funny because somebody had asked us for, you guys make corn vodka like a Tito's, and I'm like, no, we make sweet potato. I go, because they always ask, why is your vodka so expensive? I'm like, well, that's a long story, but you figure out sweet potato vodka and how they're made and grown, you'll see why it's more expensive than a corn vodka. But so we brought some in, and they had some extra corn laying around. They're like, hey, we got these culls that they sell. It's funny. Everything has you think processing, everything can just be processed. But so their corn is grown for tortilla chips and like flour tortillas. And so they go, hey, we got these rounds that we can't do anything with. And I'm like, dude, they're grinding them up and cooking them and making corn tortilla chips. And why can't they use the round corn? And they're like, oh, because it cooks at a different temperature than the flat corn. So they can't use it because if they got these cooking times and temperatures. So he's like, yeah, if you want to use this, take it and see what you can do with it. So I was like, well, here we go. Let's make some bourbon. And so we used our Merced rye, and we got some California malt from over at Admiral Maltings in Alameda. And we went to town, and was like, well, I was never a big bourbon drinker because I'm not a sweet kind of person. I like sour, and I'm more into like rye and more bitey. And so I was like, well, if we're going to do this, let's look at some traditional methods. And then so I kind of stumbled on sour mash, and kind of bought some different sour mashes, and I'm like, okay, I can do this profile, so let's try it. And I didn't realize what a pain in the ass the sour mash was going to be to do on a craft level. So we didn't make very much of it, but we were pretty stoked at how it came out at 4 years. And we're definitely going to continue to make bourbon and just keep aging it longer.
So I remember having this with out of the blind barrels. And I've actually got my tasting notes from Blind Barrels. Chocolate tobacco. I mean, it was. I had picked a single barrel of Bullet Bourbon about a year and a half ago, and it tasted like chocolate and tobacco. I mean, it was just raisiny, like it was just all over the place. This. Like, I'm going to have to put them side by side, but this super reminds me of that because it's just like chocolate covered raisins, tobacco, like wet tobacco, chewing tobacco. And I mean, my tasting notes today are pretty much spot on what I tasted the last time I had it. So I'm pretty happy with that because I remember being impressed with it just in a blind tasting, not knowing what it was.
Yeah. It's like a cold tobacco, like Buzzard's Roost. A lot of people may or may not know they do like this cold smoked bourbon or rye, like where they take they cold smoke the barrel underneath like cigar finish basically, and you get that tobacco notes, and that's what it really leans in heavily, like wet tobacco, right? Like that's the smell and the flavor profile. Now I will say I'm glad I drank it before I went to the rye and then came back to it, because the rye is a lot overpowering. So like what I remember from the front were those notes, as Scott mentioned. What I like about it is it's delicate. It's not like overpowering. It doesn't like warm your like innards. Like it doesn't have a California hug, as we say, Kentucky hug. It doesn't have that. It's just a really nice, easy, like a session type of bourbon versus a like, hey, I had one, I know I had one, and I'm done having one.
Yeah. Yeah. And we laid it down at 110. And so this one we laid it down a little bit lighter than we do our ryes. Our ryes we typically lay down at 120. So this one we laid down at 110, and it came off at the 106, which is a little bit more that giving it that, being mindful of Kentucky environment, of the little bit more humidity. So we did see a little bit more loss on where our proof going up, it went down. But I think part of that is that whole like humidity addition into the barrel room with these barrels. And then I think those chocolatey notes, again, I think a little bit is that Merced rye coming through. And I don't know, the tobacco-y flavor is, maybe because of the sour mash and taking the old mash, some of the old mash and putting it back in there, you get those yeasty kind of, that yeasty note, which is, could be kind of like a tobacco flavor.
Yeah. I find it to be just a really like easy sipper. Like, this would go really well with a cigar. Like Scott's more of a cigar aficionado than I am, but like, I feel like this would be a good cigar whiskey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm willing to test that theory. So,
so we've hit on the whiskey. So like, what's next, right? Like your craft, you can be crafty. You got this farm, you can play around with different grain and varietal, depending on like what works, for your all's landscape. Like what's next for Corbin Cash?
So, it's kind of like my first initiative was just, hey, use everything from our farm. And then it's like, okay, well then, my neighbors, shirt-tail cousins of mine have this extra corn they're going to throw away. So yeah, I'm kind of been looking at what other things can we grab from around here. But one of my I'm excited about projects has been tequila. Well, we can't call it tequila, but agave. We laid down some agave in some European oak, and it has turned out phenomenal. Fortunately, our glass shortage is not letting us release it yet because we can't get the damn glass. But it's got me thinking we might actually start growing some agave, because I think because we have this big farm and we are becoming more and more of a desert every year, and agave doesn't need a lot of water. So it might be a good transition for us versus some other crops that, that use too much water. I think agave could actually do really well in our climate. The biggest challenge is when it comes to harvesting. In Mexico, they use a lot of hand labor, and hand labor is a lot cheaper than it is in California. So that's part of the thing we're looking at now is, okay, how are we going to harvest and process this? But as far as from a farming distilling perspective, I think it could be a really good a good asset to us but of course agave is only going to be good for tequila or I guess we could always get into the syrup business, but that's no fun.
You can do some
definitely can't use your name on that product.
Yeah. So we'll see. That's one of the things I'm super excited about. I think it's that's a 2 to 5 year plan. But I've been definitely doing my research on getting pups and that sort of thing, and I'm actually growing some agave in my backyard. So I've been practicing with it. But
how long does agave take to mature?
So in our area, I would say a minimum, your fastest is going to be 5 years, but 6, 8 is really ideal. There's guys harvesting at 5, but my big thing is if you just do it like they do in Mexico and have 5 years on a raw soil and you don't use any injected fertilizer, your pina is not going to be real big. So to me, the 5-year mark, but isn't going to be enough. I'm looking 6 to 8, probably closer to 8, but using some of our organic fertilizers that we use with sweet potatoes, I want to start toying with that to see if maybe we can get them to size up a little bit faster and turn them over in 5 years. But it's delicate because, again, I'm like, I didn't really realize you could hurt agave with water, but yeah, they don't like too much water either. Even in our sandy soil, I turned a few of our tips black, and I went to my local nursery guy and I'm like, hey man, like I've never really grown agave. What am I doing wrong? He's like, too much water. And I'm like, too much water? Like, he's like, too much water. Backed it off and boom, everything grows good. So I'm like, I've never had a plant in California that said, oh, you're giving me too much water. So this could be a good thing.
You're onto something there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's super interesting. And I love that, you all can play around with things like that because, like agave rye, like I feel like that could go really, really well together and some things like that and make some cool cocktails and, maybe even some RTDs. It's like, I can give you some business ideas. Pro bono.
Yeah. And we're working with some smoked malt now. So one of our local grain guys up in Sacramento that grows malt, and so one of my passion project, he brought me some apple smoked malt the other day, and I'm just like, oh, dude, like I'm doing so. Yes, a smoked apple rye is kind of what I'm working on right now. We're doing a little bit of caramel malted rye with some smoked apple malt and then the Merced rye. So it sounds good to me. We'll see what it comes out like. Yeah. We're going to start on that in the next couple of weeks.
No, for sure. And so, super excited to kind of watch you all over the next few years as you all continue to move forward in your whiskey making. But for our listeners who may not be familiar with it, where can people find out more about Corbin Cash, and can they get it outside of the state of California?
So we do have some retailers. I think the best place to go is our website. Anybody that's in state, we can ship. You can buy directly off of our website for in-state, but we do have retailers that do ship out of state. So there's a few, we got a handful in Southern California that do ship out of state. And I think we have a out of state button on our website that lists all of our retailers that do ship out of state. And if they're having trouble, give us a call at the distillery and we'll figure it out for you. Because I know we have 1 or 2 that ship to like 46 states. So
awesome. And then can people find you all and connect with you all on social media?
Yeah. So Facebook, Instagram. We don't really do Twitter, but we have a Twitter account, but it's not very popular. We don't really do anything with it. But Facebook and Instagram, Corbin Cash Distillery, you can find us there.
Awesome. Well, David, we really appreciate you all sitting down and talking, Corbin Cash, Merced Rye, and Sour Mash Bourbon with us tonight. It's been, a pleasure getting to meet you all and excited, for what you all have. It gives me the feels of when we've sat down with a variety of other grain to glass distilleries that you all are onto something special. And so, keep doing what y'all are doing.
Yeah, we appreciate, these are always fun and the most informative, and the people that listen to you guys are like, they're the heart of our business, because they're the ones that are like seeking out the new things. And that's not all of America yet, right? Everybody's kind of like, oh, I just like my big names and they know about it. And so it's podcasts and interviews like this that really help build our brands on an organic level. And so we appreciate you guys very much.
Yeah.
And so, maybe we'll get you, maybe we'll get one of these single barrels out to you guys so you can try what it, it's always interesting to see like you guys picked up on a lot of the notes that I find that a lot of people don't, when it's a blended like the 1917, but when you do a specific single barrels, more of that fruit note you're talking about shines through. It's kind of crazy. So we'll have to get you guys one of those so you can try it.
More whiskey, perfect. Scott? Will you turn that down?
Happy to do some testing and tasting.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. No, well, hey, we appreciate it. Thanks for taking time. I know it's busy season for you all, but we really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you guys so much.
Yeah. Well, everyone, thank you for listening to this episode of The Bourbon Lens, and thank you for Corbin Cash for spending some time with us tonight. As always, you can find out more about Bourbon Lens on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. Also, go check out our newly redesigned website at bourbonlens.com, where we post reviews, new whiskey news, and of course, the podcast is featured right at the front of the website. And last but not least, go to your favorite podcast listening app, hit subscribe, and make sure that you give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.